It started like any other high-profile interview on Good Morning America, polished, polite, and reverent. The morning air outside the studio was crisp, but inside, the energy buzzed. Clint Eastwood, a cinematic legend whose career had spanned over 6 decades, was the guest of honor. Dressed in a charcoal blazer and his signature stoic calm, he walked onto the set to a warm applause from the studio audience. His latest film, Iron Resolve, was generating early Oscar buzz, and the nation was ready to hear the icon's thoughts on filmmaking, legacy, and maybe even retirement. George Stephanopoulos welcomed him with a wide smile. "Clint, it's a real honor to have you with us today." Clint nodded, his voice gravelly but firm. "Appreciate it, George." The first few minutes went smoothly. They laughed about Clint's early days on Rawhide, touched on his transition from actor to director, and discussed the generational impact of films like Unforgiven and Gran Torino. Viewers at home saw a rare, vulnerable Clint, the legend opening up about age, change, and purpose. But then, with a subtle shift in tone, George changed direction. "Your new film, Iron Resolve, centers on a man who defies government pressure and chooses individual liberty over collective control," George said carefully. "Some critics say the film promotes a very libertarian, even anti-establishment message. In today's polarized political climate, is that a responsible choice?" Clint raised an eyebrow, his posture stiffening. "Responsible," he echoed. "George, I make movies to tell stories, not to fit anyone's politics." George leaned forward slightly, "But considering your history of political statements, and even your speech at the RNC years ago, don't you think your films carry a certain influence?" Clint exhaled slowly. "I've never made films to influence people politically. I tell stories about real people facing real choices. If that rattles a few cages, maybe those cages needed rattling." There was a beat of awkward silence. Behind the camera, producers exchanged glances. A floor manager gave a subtle cut signal, but George continued. "Clint, I just want to press this a little further. In an age where misinformation is dangerous, where public figures have massive platforms, don't you think there's a risk in glorifying rebellion or painting government as the enemy?" That did it. Clint shifted forward, voice low and firm. "Let me ask you something, George. When you report the news, do you do it to inform or to steer opinion?" George blinked. "To inform, of course. Exactly. And when I make a film, I do it to entertain and provoke thought, not to babysit people's emotions." Applause rippled lightly from a few audience members before a nervous silence fell again. George gave a tight smile, but his eyes flickered with tension. "I just think," George began, "that as a public figure, you have a responsibility." Clint interrupted, his voice rising a notch. "You think? That's the issue. I've lived long enough to know what responsibility looks like. It's not coddling people, it's telling the truth, even if it's uncomfortable." The control room was already in chaos. Producers scrambled, whispering into earpieces, and camera angles began shifting awkwardly. One assistant tried signaling to George to move to a break, but he ignored it. "We appreciate your perspective, Clint," George said finally, a strained civility returning to his voice. "Maybe we just have a difference of opinion." Clint stood up, his expression unreadable. "Difference of opinion's fine, George. But next time, don't invite me on for a tribute if you're planning a trial." With that, he turned, nodded once toward the audience, and walked off the stage, leaving George frozen in place in the entire studio in stunned silence. Seconds later, the screen abruptly cut to a commercial. The internet, however, didn't wait. Clint Eastwood's walk-off was already trending before the first advertisement ended. The moment the commercial break hit, chaos erupted behind the scenes at Good Morning America. Producers huddled in panic, assistants scrambled to adjust the show's rundown, and George Stephanopoulos sat motionless in his chair, still stunned by what had just happened. Clint Eastwood, never one to linger, had already made his way out of the building, refusing a car service and instead strolling down 66th Street with his jacket slung over his shoulder like a modern-day cowboy who'd just walked out of a saloon fight. Backstage, whispers flew. "Did we just kick off Clint Eastwood? Is he really gone? Do we air the rest of the segment?" But it didn't matter. The cameras might have cut away, but the moment was already alive online. Within minutes, the clip had hit social media, taken by a sharp-eyed audience member filming from their seat. On X, the trending tag hashtag Clint vs George soared to #1. One video captioned, "Clint walks out. GMA fumbles hard," was shared over 1 million times in under 2 hours. Comment sections exploded with passionate takes. "He stood up for freedom of expression. Respect. George ambushed him with politics. So unprofessional. Eastwood stuck in the past. That was embarrassing. The man's 94 and still sharper than the entire panel combined." GMA quickly released a carefully worded statement later that morning. The division in public opinion was undeniable. Morning talk shows the next day debated the incident, with hosts choosing sides like political pundits. Some called George brave for challenging Clint. Others slammed him for turning what should have been a tribute into a confrontation. Behind the scenes at ABC, sources whispered that George was deeply frustrated and felt Clint had overreacted. But his public silence spoke volumes. For once, the veteran journalist had nothing to say. And then came the unexpected twist. Just 3 days later, Clint Eastwood appeared on The Joe Rogan Experience, a podcast known for its unfiltered, long-form conversations. Wearing a worn leather jacket and a bemused grin, Eastwood addressed the controversy head-on. "I've dealt with real tough guys in my day," he said, "and believe me, George Stephanopoulos ain't one of them." Joe laughed. "Were you surprised by the line of questioning?" "Not surprised," Clint said, sipping coffee. "Just tired of the act. These people invite you on, smile at you, then flip the script and hope you trip. That's not journalism, that's theater." When asked what he would do next, Clint leaned forward, that familiar glint in his eye returning. "I'm writing something, a screenplay. Working title is the last word. It's about a man who's supposed to fade away, but instead, he walks into the system and calls its bluff." Social media lit up all over again. Memes flooded the internet. One viral post showed Clint walking out of the GMA studio with the words, "Legend never blinks." Another photoshopped George into a cowboy showdown with Clint, the caption reading, "Should have known better, partner." Within days, major studios were bidding on the last word, despite no confirmed script and no director yet attached. Rumors swirled that Eastwood planned to direct and star in the film himself, making it a possible swan song to his already mythic career. Meanwhile, George returned to his GMA chair, but the atmosphere had changed. Some audience members noticed he was less assertive, a little more cautious. Whether it was guilt or just PR damage control, no one could say. But one thing was clear. Clint Eastwood had entered a morning show and walked out a trending topic, a viral icon, and somehow, again, a man redefining what it meant to age without apologizing.